February 1943, North Africa. The German tank crews of the Africa Corps were veterans of war. They had crossed deserts, fought in the shadow of Rommel's reputation, and trusted the discipline of their Panzer divisions. But on one dusty morning near Kasserine Pass, they saw something that made even hardened commanders whisper in disbelief. 5 American Sherman tanks appeared through the smoke. They were scattered across broken ground, hidden from each other by rocks and ridges. By German doctrine, that should have meant chaos. Without line of sight, without hand signals, without a commander shouting orders, no unit could possibly stay coordinated. Yet these Shermans moved as if one single hand guided them. One shifted left to cover a blind spot. Another advanced just as its partner slowed, plugging gaps before they opened. Their timing was eerie, almost supernatural. A German officer stared through his field glasses, muttering, "Unmöglich, impossible." The Panzers tried to answer. Orders crackled over their Fug 5 radios, but the voices dissolved into static. The 10-watt transmitters, once praised as cutting-edge in the 1930s, now struggled to be heard over engine noise and the chaos of battle. Some tanks had no transmitter at all, only receivers. Those crews could listen to commands, but could not reply, leaving their commanders blind. In one platoon, only the lead tank could send a message. When it was hit, the others were left in silence, cut off from the wider fight. Meanwhile, the American crews inside their Shermans heard something altogether different. Clear voices, sharp as if spoken in the same room. No static, no fading signals, just steady instructions flowing back and forth across miles of desert. Unbeknownst to the Germans, every Sherman tank carried an FM radio set, an invisible weapon as decisive as any gun. These radios weren't just slightly better, they were a revolution. With crystal-controlled frequency stability and more than double the power of German sets, they cut through the battlefield's noise like a blade through paper. Each American crewman fought with the knowledge that he was never truly alone. Even when dust clouds hid their comrades from view, their voices remained linked by unseen threads. They could call for artillery, warn of enemy ambushes, or even take command if their leader fell. The Germans couldn't understand it. To them, it seemed like the Shermans had some sixth sense. How could tanks move in perfect unison across terrain that blocked all visual contact? How could units coordinate strikes across miles when German radios failed after a few hundred meters? Rumors began spreading among captured German POWs. Some swore the Americans had secret spotters hidden in the hills, signaling with mirrors. Others believed the Allies had trained their tankers to read each other's movements without words. But the truth was more shocking and more dangerous to Nazi Germany's future than any single battle. The Americans had built not just tanks, but a network. A battlefield web invisible to the eye, yet more powerful than armor or firepower. And as the Africa Corps would soon discover, this was only the beginning. Because those radios weren't an accident. They were the result of America's industrial might, its engineers, and its belief that communication was the true weapon of modern war. What German commanders dismissed as luck in Tunisia was about to evolve into a nightmare stretching from the mountains of Italy to the beaches of Normandy. The Panzers had better armor, they had powerful guns, but they did not have what the Shermans had, voices that could carry through fire and steel. And when the war reached Europe, that difference would decide battles. September 1943. Italy. When American Shermans rolled onto Italian soil, German commanders breathed easier. At last, the mountains would be on their side. Valleys twisted into dead ends, ridges blocked sight lines, and fog smothered the land. This was terrain that punished coordination. Even the best radios struggled in such conditions. The Wehrmacht had learned long ago that their FUG-5 radios were unreliable in hills and forests. Every ridge bent and bounced signals, turning urgent orders into garbled whispers. Panzers often resorted to flares or hand signals, a system that worked only in open ground. In the Italian countryside, those signals vanished behind stone walls and thick woods. But when the fighting began, something terrifying happened. Sherman tanks communicated as if the mountains weren't even there. Across ridgelines, through valleys, over broken villages, their voices stayed clear. Platoons that should have been blind to each other moved like chess pieces under one grand hand. One tank platoon pressed through a gorge, while another, unseen, flanked around a ridge. Both struck in perfect timing, catching German defenders in a trap they never saw coming. German soldiers couldn't believe it. "How can they coordinate like this?" one officer demanded. "They cannot even see each other." The answer lay in the heart of every Sherman, the SCR 508 FM radio set. Unlike Germany's AM systems, which absorbed every spark of interference, FM filtered out the noise. No engine rumble, no static, no drifting off frequency, just pure, steady voices. One American crewman later wrote in his diary, "It's strange to think about, but the radio is like a rope tied to every tank. You never feel cut off. Even when the valley walls close around you, you hear your brother's voices. That's what keeps you from feeling alone." To German tankers, it was the opposite. Isolation haunted them. Crews often fought as individuals, unable to call for help or even warn their comrades. One German POW captured near Salerno admitted bitterly, "When our command tank is destroyed, we are deaf and dumb. The Americans fight as a team, we fight as orphans." The contrast became deadly in the battles around Monte Cassino. American armored columns wound through narrow roads where ambushes lurked around every bend. Normally, such terrain should have favored the defenders, but the Shermans used their radios to warn each other of mines, artillery fire, and anti-tank guns. Crews that had never met before, pulled from different companies, coordinated as if they'd trained together for years. For the Germans, the mountains turned into tombs. Without clear communication, their ambushes often triggered too early or too late. Some panzer platoons waited for orders that never came. Others advanced alone into the teeth of American artillery, not knowing support had already been destroyed miles away. The lesson was brutal. The Germans had superior tanks, but they had no way to make those tanks act as one. The Americans, with their supposedly inferior Shermans, could combine their strength at will. And soon this advantage would be tested in the greatest invasion of the war. Because if Sherman radios worked in mountains and valleys, what would happen when they landed on the beaches of Normandy, face to face with Hitler's Atlantic Wall? The answer would shake German high command to its core. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The beaches shook under German fire. Mortars exploded, machine guns swept the sand, and Sherman tanks rolled off the landing craft into chaos. For many crews, it was their first time hearing bullets ping off armor. But amid the terror, one thing held steady: the voices on the radio. Sherman commanders spoke calmly to each other, adjusting positions, calling for naval fire, and steering infantrymen away from kill zones. The SCR 508 radios turned the invasion into something the Germans had never imagined. A battle directed not by whistles or flares, but by invisible words cutting through the thunder of war. German defenders noticed. Their own panzers, struggling to reposition inland, were crippled by silence. Radio messages sputtered with static, breaking into half-heard fragments. Some crews relied on runners, men darting between vehicles under fire with handwritten notes. Many never returned. Yet just when the Americans seemed unstoppable, a shocking problem emerged. Tank radios could not talk to infantry radios. The Shermans spoke on frequencies between 20 and 27 megahertz. The foot soldiers carried the SCR 300 backpack radios, tuned to 40 to 48 megahertz. The two systems were like neighbors shouting through walls, close but completely cut off. The result was deadly. In the hedgerows of Normandy, German infantry with Panzerfausts crept close to American tanks. Sometimes they were only yards away, hidden by thick green walls, preparing to strike. American infantry saw them, but they had no way to warn the tanks. Voices screamed, but inside the steel beasts, the crews heard nothing. One survivor wrote bitterly, "We knocked on the halls, we waved our arms, but the tanks couldn't hear. Then the fire came, and men were burned alive inside." German commanders quickly realized this weakness. They ordered their infantry to exploit it, using the hedgerows as hunting grounds. More than once a Sherman was destroyed while friendly GIs stood helplessly nearby. But American ingenuity did not sleep. Within weeks, crews began welding ammunition boxes to the backs of their tanks. Inside each box was a simple EE-8 field telephone wired directly into the tank's intercom. Now an infantryman could lift the receiver, press it to his ear, and speak directly to the men inside. It was crude, it was improvised, but it worked. By late July, during Operation Cobra, this innovation transformed tank infantry teamwork. Soldiers could warn tanks of ambushes, guide them through hedgerows, and call down fire on hidden machine guns. German troops, who had celebrated the Americans' communication gap, now found themselves hunted once more. Still, the lesson of Normandy was clear. Even the best technology had limits. Radios gave the Americans an invisible advantage, but war was never simple. The Germans still had their deadly weapons, and every gap in Allied systems was punished in blood. For the Sherman crews, Normandy was a baptism of fire. They had learned the strength of their radios, but also the danger of assuming those radios solved everything. And as July dawned, another test awaited. This time, it would not be about survival on the beaches or in the hedgerows. It would be about unleashing the true power of coordination across hundreds of tanks. The Germans would soon face an enemy that no longer stumbled through obstacles, but moved like an unstoppable tide. The battlefield was about to echo with voices calling out across miles, voices the Germans could never silence. Late July 1944, Normandy. The fields of France shook as American bombers carpeted the German lines. Dust, smoke, and broken trees covered the landscape. Out of this devastation rolled the 2nd Armored Division, more than 200 Sherman tanks moving as one. The operation was codenamed Cobra. For the Germans waiting in the hedgerows, it felt like a hammer blow. The Panzer Division, once considered one of Nazi Germany's finest armored units, stood in their path. These were veteran soldiers, well-trained, with Panthers and heavy weapons. But as the Shermans advanced, something felt wrong. The Americans did not stumble or hesitate. They did not waste time in confusion. Instead, every tank seemed to know exactly where the others were, shifting like a school of fish through the chaos. When German anti-tank guns fired, the Shermans responded instantly, calling down artillery within minutes. When infantry broke through the hedgerows, nearby tanks shifted positions without waiting for orders from above. It was as if the entire division shared a single brain. The secret, once again, was radio. Each Sherman carried the SCR 508 FM set, powerful enough to link dozens, sometimes hundreds of tanks at once. Crystal-controlled frequencies kept channels stable, and commanders could monitor both platoon and company networks. Orders flowed like water, quick and unbroken. German tankers tried to respond, but their radios betrayed them. Most of their Panzers carried only receivers. They could hear commands, but could not reply. Coordination collapsed the moment a command tank was destroyed, and in Cobra, American artillery made sure command tanks were prime targets. One German survivor wrote later, "It was like fighting ghosts. Every time we struck, they already knew. Every time we moved, they adjusted. We could not understand how they kept order when scattered across miles. We thought they had eyes in the sky." The truth was even more unsettling. The Americans had built an invisible network, a battlefield web that allowed any Sherman to become the leader if another fell. No single point of failure, no collapse when one man died. For German infantry, the experience was just as grim. They watched American tanks react to threats with lightning speed. If one squad opened fire, within minutes artillery shells rained down. If a Panther revealed itself, nearby Shermans and tank destroyers closed in before it could escape. The battlefield no longer moved at human speed. It moved at the speed of radio. The result was catastrophic for Panzer Lehr. Once considered an elite formation, it was shredded in days. Communications broke down so completely that some German units fought alone, unaware their comrades had already retreated. Others received orders too late to matter, arriving in battle piecemeal, only to be destroyed in detail. The Americans called it coordination. The Germans called it witchcraft. One captured officer, trembling with frustration, admitted, "Your tanks, they talk to each other. Ours die in silence." By the end of Cobra, the German front in Normandy was collapsing. Entire divisions fell back, leaving burning wrecks in the bocage. The Allies poured through the gap, racing into the open plains of France. And this was only the beginning. Because as the Shermans pushed deeper, their radios would prove even more valuable, not just in France, but in the very heart of Germany itself. For the first time, German high command began to suspect that this strange advantage wasn't luck or discipline. It was something else, something they didn't yet understand. And soon, in the battles ahead, that misunderstanding would cost them more than just ground. It would cost them the war. August 1944, France. The hedgerows were behind them. Ahead lay the wide, open plains of northern France, land perfect for armored warfare. Here, German commanders believed their Panthers and Tigers would finally prove unstoppable. Their armor was thicker, their guns deadlier. By the numbers, no Sherman should have stood a chance. But numbers lied. Because while the Germans counted tank against tank, the Americans counted voices. And in France, those voices moved faster than steel. Patton's Third Army swept across the countryside like a storm. His armored columns stretched for miles, yet his units never lost touch. A single discovery at the front, a weak spot, a bridge still standing, an unguarded road, was reported by radio within minutes. Orders shifted instantly. Battalions miles apart swung like doors on the same hinge, striking where the Germans were weakest. For the Wehrmacht, it was maddening. Their telephone lines, once the backbone of command, were constantly destroyed by Allied aircraft. Messages sent by courier took hours, sometimes days. By the time an order reached the front, the battlefield had already changed. One German officer wrote bitterly, "Our enemy does not move with tanks alone. He moves with a web of voices. We, meanwhile, are blind and mute." The results were devastating. In one clash near Ardennes, German units prepared an ambush.
Panthers crouched at the edge of a village, waiting for Shermans to blunder into their guns. But before they could fire, American artillery struck with deadly accuracy. The Shermans had spotted them, radioed their coordinates, and unleashed a barrage within minutes. When the smoke cleared, half the ambush lay in ruins. Survivors retreated in disbelief. Captured German POWs whispered that the Americans must have spies hidden everywhere. Others claimed the Allies had invented some kind of radar for tanks. Few imagined the truth, that the Americans had simply given every tank the power to speak. For the Sherman crews, the difference was personal. Letters home often described the strange comfort of never being alone. One gunner wrote, "You hear voices all the time. Even when you can't see a soul, you know they're there. It keeps you steady. You don't panic." But for German tankers, the silence was suffocating. When a command tank burned, the rest of the platoon fought as orphans, alone, uncoordinated, and afraid. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most skilled tank commanders, later admitted in his memoir that limited communications often left him fighting blind. It was a weakness he could never fix. The difference showed in speed. American armored columns advanced dozens of miles in days, while German units struggled to move at all. They were trapped in a war that no longer waited for them. And so in August 1944, the German front cracked wide open. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers retreated in chaos. The Allies surged forward, their Shermans acting as the spearhead of a vast, connected machine. For the first time, German high command began to realize this was not luck, this was not chance. Something invisible was guiding the Americans, something the Reich had no answer for. And soon, as the Allies neared the German border, that invisible weapon would tear apart even their most powerful formations. The question echoing through German ranks was simple, desperate, and unanswered. How can we fight an enemy whose tanks never fight alone? December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow blanketed the forests. The air was bitter cold. German forces launched their last great gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. Their plan was simple: strike hard through weak American lines, split the Allies in two, and force a peace. At first, it worked. American units were surprised, overrun, and scattered. German Panthers and Tigers prowled through villages, while Allied soldiers fled or surrendered. It seemed, for a moment, that the Reich had regained its deadly blitzkrieg spirit. But then, the counterattacks began. American commanders, even those caught in chaos, used their radios to pull shattered units back together. A tank platoon retreating through a snow-choked road could still call to others miles away. Infantry pinned down in a village could radio for Shermans to swing in and blast the attackers. The Germans had firepower, they had experience, but again, they lacked the invisible glue of coordination. Inside Panther tanks, crews cursed at their radios. Static hissed louder than voices. Messages cut in and out, distorted by forest and snow. Often, only the lead tank could transmit, and when it was destroyed, the rest were left in silence. More than once, entire platoons attacked at the wrong time because they never received the order to wait. The Americans turned this weakness into opportunity. Near Bastogne, surrounded and under siege, the 101st Airborne held out largely because of constant radio coordination with nearby Sherman units and artillery batteries. Even isolated, they were never cut off. A paratrooper later said, "The Germans had us surrounded, but we had radios, so really, it was them who were surrounded." Patton's Third Army then performed one of the most famous maneuvers of the war, pivoting north through snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. It seemed impossible, an army shifting direction in days through frozen roads. but Patton's orders flowed across his armored columns by radio. Units spread over miles moved as one, arriving in time to smash the German advance. Meanwhile, German units struggled to even find each other. Their fuel convoys were ambushed because no warning reached them in time. Their tanks wandered into traps because coordination collapsed. A German officer, captured after the battle, admitted, "We had better tanks, but no way to fight as one." The Americans moved like wolves. We fought like lonely dogs. The contrast was stark. German soldiers marched into the Ardennes believing they could break the Americans' will. Instead, they discovered that every Sherman tank was part of a vast web of voices, unbreakable, flexible, and fast. By January 1945, the great counteroffensive was broken. Thousands of German soldiers were dead or captured. The Reich had thrown its last dice and lost. And in the wreckage of the Ardennes, the Germans still didn't fully understand why. They thought American coordination came from discipline, from rigid procedures. Few realized the truth, that technology itself had rewritten the rules of war. Now the road to Germany lay open, and soon, as American Shermans crossed the Rhine, radios would deliver perhaps the most decisive victory of all. The end was coming, but for many German tank crews, the cruelest truth was still ahead. They would lose not because they lacked courage, nor because they lacked powerful machines, but because their machines fought in silence, while their enemies' machines never did. March 1945. The Rhine River. For years, the Rhine had been Hitler's great barrier. German propaganda boasted that no enemy would ever cross it. Bridges were fortified, charges planted, defenses waiting. To cross this river meant stepping into the Reich's very heart. On March 7th, near the small town of Remagen, American soldiers discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. Explosives had been placed, but by some miracle, the bridge had not been destroyed. The Germans had hesitated. The Americans did not. Within minutes, radios crackled across the front. The 9th Armored Division's discovery was transmitted up the chain of command with lightning speed. 1st Army Headquarters knew almost instantly. Orders flew out just as fast. Secure the bridge, reinforce it, pour men and machines across before the Germans could react. Sherman tanks rumbled forward, their radios alive with voices. Platoons miles apart shifted routes to converge on Remagen. Engineers were called in immediately. Artillery support repositioned itself. What might have taken hours in the old wars of paper maps and couriers now happened in minutes. German defenders scrambled to respond, but they were trapped in the past. Their telephone lines were shattered by air attacks. Radio messages sputtered with interference. By the time orders reached some units, the Americans were already across. The shock was enormous. The Ludendorff Bridge had not only given the Allies a crossing point, it had revealed the speed at which American coordination could move. A German officer later admitted, "They reacted before we even knew what had happened. Their decisions traveled like light. Ours crawled like shadows." The battle for the bridge raged for days. German artillery, Luftwaffe bombers, even desperate frogmen tried to destroy it. But the bridgehead grew stronger with every passing hour. Radios turned chaos into order, linking tanks, infantry, engineers, and aircraft into a single, unbreakable force. For Sherman crews, the radios meant more than victory. They meant survival. One tank commander wrote in his diary, "Everywhere shells were falling. Smoke covered the river, but the voices kept us steady. Without them, we would have been blind. With them, we were part of something greater." German units, by contrast, stumbled in isolation. Some counterattacks arrived too early, others too late. Tank platoons entered the fight without knowing where their neighbors were. More than once, German soldiers advanced into a storm of fire because their commanders had no way to warn them of what lay ahead. The result was inevitable. The Allies secured their bridgehead, and within weeks, more crossings were forced along the Rhine. The barrier that Hitler had promised would never be breached was gone. And behind that breach was not just raw power, it was connection. Radios had turned the American army into something Germany could no longer match, a living network. For the German troops still fighting, the realization sunk in with dread. They had not just been outnumbered, they had been outcommunicated. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most trusted commanders, sent his final messages during these battles. His words captured the despair. No contact with adjacent units, no contact with higher command. Fighting continues, but coordination is impossible. It was the sound of a broken army. And as American tanks rolled deeper into Germany, the question was no longer whether the Reich would fall, but how many lives would be lost before silence claimed it completely. April 1945. The Ruhr Valley. It was the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the Ruhr, filled with factories, steelworks, and the remnants of Hitler's once mighty war machine. More than 300,000 German soldiers crowded the region, many of them exhausted veterans, others raw recruits thrown into the fire. To hold the Ruhr was to hold Germany's last hope of resistance. But the Allies came not with hope, but with voices. American 1st and 9th Armies executed a vast double envelopment, moving around the Ruhr from north and south. To coordinate such a maneuver in the middle of a dying war seemed impossible. Yet for the Americans, radios turned impossibility into routine. Tank columns spread across hundreds of miles remained in constant touch. Orders shifted fluidly. Battalions adjusted on the fly. The Germans, inside the pocket, lived in silence. Allied aircraft struck telephone lines again and again. German radios, weak and outdated, sputtered with static. Many units lost contact with their superiors entirely. Some divisions fought on, unaware their neighbors had already surrendered. A Sherman commander later recalled, "It felt like we were tying a net, and every time we pulled, more Germans were caught. They had nowhere to go because we knew exactly where each of our units stood. They didn't." For the trapped soldiers, the experience was surreal. Cut off from higher command, some officers sent runners with handwritten notes, men who often vanished into the chaos. Field Marshal Walter Model, tasked with defending the Ruhr, sent desperate final messages. No contact with adjacent units. No communication with higher headquarters. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. It was the confession of defeat. Inside their Shermans, American crews felt the difference on a human level. Even when scattered across villages and forests, they heard each other's voices. They shared warnings, victories, and even humor across the ether. Radios carried not just orders, but morale. German tankers, by contrast, fought in a crushing loneliness. One Panther gunner captured in the Ruhr said bitterly, "We were deaf and we were blind. Each tank was its own war." The outcome was certain. By mid-April, the Ruhr pocket collapsed. More than 325,000 German troops surrendered, an entire army group erased. The numbers dwarfed even Stalingrad. And at the core of this victory was not only American numbers or firepower, but speed of coordination. Every Sherman, every half-track, every command post linked into a network that Germany could not hope to match. The irony cut deep. Years earlier, Germany had pioneered radio warfare. Blitzkrieg itself had been born from tanks equipped with radios, enabling rapid thrusts into Poland and France. Heinz Guderian had preached that communication was the bloodline of armored war. Yet by 1945, Germany was crippled by the very weakness its own doctrine had once sought to avoid. As German soldiers laid down their arms in the Ruhr, some asked their captors the same haunting question: "How did you always know where to strike?" The Americans rarely answered. For them, the secret was no secret at all. It was simply the steady hum of radios that had been with them from North Africa to Germany. The war was nearly over. But before it ended, the Germans would face one last humiliation: to learn that what defeated them was not always the bigger gun or the thicker armor, but the voices that never fell silent.
April 1945. Central Germany. The Reich was crumbling. Cities burned. Refugees clogged the roads, and the once proud Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. Yet in the villages and forests of central Germany, tank battles still raged. The last Panthers and Tigers fought with desperate courage, but their crews were haunted by a truth they could no longer ignore. They were fighting in silence. Inside a Sherman, a commander spoke calmly into his throat microphone. His gunner, driver, and loader all heard the words clearly through headsets. Beyond his tank, voices from other Shermans filled the air. Reports of ambushes, artillery calls, warnings of hidden Panthers, it all flowed instantly. A tank platoon moved as if stitched together by invisible thread. In a German Panther nearby, the contrast was brutal. The commander tried to shout over the roar of the Maybach engine. His radio sputtered with static, messages fading in and out. His gunner strained to hear but caught only fragments. When the lead tank was destroyed, the rest of the platoon had no way of knowing whether to advance or retreat. Each crew fought its own lonely war. One German veteran later admitted, "The silence was the worst. You knew comrades were out there, but you could not hear them. Every tank felt like an island." For the Americans, the radios carried more than orders. They carried morale. Even in burned-out towns, with artillery falling and smoke choking the sky, the voices of other crews reminded them they were never alone. One Sherman gunner wrote home, "You don't think about being scared when you hear the others talking. It's like being in a crowd, even when you can't see a soul." This psychological edge mattered. German crews, though often better trained, were worn down by isolation. They never knew if reinforcements were coming. They never knew if neighbors still lived. And when they realized the Shermans always seemed to fight together, despair crept in. The statistics told the same story. In battles like Aracourt and later across the German plains, Shermans destroyed enemy tanks at ratios that stunned even Allied commanders. Superior armor and guns should have tipped the scales, but the Americans' ability to coordinate turned every engagement into a team fight against isolated opponents. Even German intelligence misunderstood what was happening. Reports spoke of American radio discipline, believing it came from strict training. They never realized that technology itself, the FM clarity, the crystal-controlled channels, and the universal deployment was what gave Americans their unbreakable edge. By now, even German commanders recognized the disaster. Field Marshal Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, admitted in private memoranda that American coordination nullified German advantages. But it was too late. Production had collapsed. Radios were scarce.
No miracle was coming. In those final weeks, the emotional gap widened. American crews joked over their headsets, trading news, even singing to calm their nerves. German crews fought in grim silence, their only sounds the clang of shells and the screams of dying comrades. And as the Americans advanced deeper into Germany, that silence became unbearable. One captured German tanker, his Panther smoldering behind him, told his interrogators simply, "You did not beat our tanks, you beat our loneliness." The war was almost finished. Berlin was under siege. Hitler's empire was in its death throes. But before the guns fell silent, one last truth would emerge, that the real weapon of the Sherman was not its gun or armor, but the invisible voices that bound its crews into an army that could never be broken apart.
May 1945. Germany. The war was ending. Columns of weary German soldiers trudged down roads, hands raised, eyes hollow. Cities lay in ruins. The once mighty Wehrmacht had surrendered, not in one climactic battle, but in 1,000 fragments of broken units, cut off from each other. For American tank crews, the end brought a strange quiet. The radios that once carried urgent orders now carried relief, laughter, and disbelief that they had survived. But for the Germans laying down their arms, the silence was heavier. It was the silence of defeat, an echo of the war they had fought in isolation. After the surrender, Allied technical teams examined captured German tanks. Their findings confirmed what battlefield experience had already proven. The Fug 5 radios were outdated, unreliable, and scarce. Many German tanks had carried no transmitters at all. By contrast, every single one of the 49,000 Shermans built carried the SCR 508 FM set. The numbers were staggering. American radios transmitted at 25 watts, with ranges up to 10 miles, their channels locked steady by crystal control. German sets transmitted at less than half that power, drifting constantly, drowning in static. Worse still, Germany had produced only a fraction of the radios needed for its armored forces. Even the best tanks in the world were often mute on the battlefield. The lesson was unavoidable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, at the signing of Germany's surrender, reportedly muttered, "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." Whether apocryphal or true, the words captured the essence of the war's final truth. Shermans were not the best tanks in isolation, but they were never alone. Each was a node in a vast network, a web of voices that turned steel machines into coordinated packs. Against that, even tigers and panthers fought as individuals, strong but solitary, doomed by silence. For German POWs, the realization came slowly, painfully. Many had entered the war believing in the superiority of German engineering. Now they sat in camps, hearing Allied guards talk casually over radios, and wondered how they had ever hoped to win without such tools. One captured Panzer officer confessed, "We thought discipline was our strength. We thought training would carry us. But your radios made every man into a commander. That we could not match." Historians later wrote that the electromagnetic spectrum itself had become a battlefield, and in that unseen war, America had crushed Nazi Germany. The legacy lived on. After the war, modern armies, German, Soviet, American alike, rebuilt their doctrines around universal communication. No tank, no platoon, no army would ever again go to battle without radios binding them together. The principle was eternal. Connection equals survival. Isolation equals defeat. For the men who fought, though, it was simpler.
An American Sherman commander summed it up years later: "Our gun wasn't the best, our armor wasn't the thickest, but our radios, they gave us each other. And that made us unstoppable." The German tankers who had fought bravely but alone learned that lesson too late. Their powerful machines had been tigers, yes, but tigers hunting in silence, while the Shermans hunted in packs. And so, when the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the last truth to echo across the battlefields was not just of who had the strongest tanks, but who had the strongest voices. The Americans had built not just an army of machines, but an army of connection. And connection had won the war.